Welcome to Calming Bedtime Historian channel. Tonight we step quietly into a lonely winter cabin where the fire has already died. The snow keeps falling beyond the trees and the cold waits patiently beside your bed like an unwelcome visitor. What did settlers truly feel during those endless frontier nights when warmth disappeared completely? How did ordinary families survive darkness so bitter that water froze beside them before morning arrived? Some early travellers described waking with frost covering their blankets, while others whispered about hearing trees explode in the frozen wilderness outside. Frontier life always sounds romantic during daylight hours. At midnight, with no fire left alive, it becomes something very different. So before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. And while you are here, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. Now dim the lights and let yourself drift slowly into the frozen silence of the frontier. You stand outside this cabin just before sunset, your boots pressing into old snow hardened by several weeks of bitter weather. The forest around you looks still and heavy beneath layers of white frost. Pine branches sag quietly beneath ice. The fading sky glows pale silver above distant hills. Somewhere far away a crow calls once before disappearing into the darkening woods. The cabin itself appears sturdy enough from a distance. Up close it feels smaller. The rough logs lean slightly from years of weather and shrinking timber. Thin smoke no longer rises from the stone chimney. That detail troubles you immediately. A cabin without smoke in winter rarely promises comfort. You step toward the crooked wooden door, hearing it creak sharply beneath the pressure of cold air. Your fingers already ache despite thick wool gloves. Settlers often described winter pain beginning in the hands first. The fingertips stiffened quietly before the deeper cold settled into the bones themselves. Inside the cabin smells faintly of damp wood, old animal hide and cooled ashes. The scent lingers heavily in the still air. You notice the fire pit immediately. Grey ash fills the hearth. A few blackened logs rest uselessly beneath a layer of white dust. No flame remains alive, not even a spark. The last wood was burned earlier during the afternoon meal. Tomorrow someone must search the forest again despite deep snow and dangerous winds. Tonight there will be no fire. You close the door carefully behind you. Even that small movement matters. Frontier cabins leaked heat constantly through gaps between logs' poorly fitted roofs and uneven floorboards. Historical records from American frontier settlements reveal that many cabins lost warmth almost immediately after fires faded. Some families stuffed moss mud or animal fur between the logs to slow the drafts. Others, on the simply endured the cold as best they could. You feel the draft immediately near your ankles. Tiny streams of frozen air slide across the floor like invisible water. The cabin remains slightly warmer than outside, though not by much. Your breath hangs pale in front of your face. A woman near the table wraps another blanket around her shoulders without speaking. Her movements appear slow from exhaustion. The children nearby sit quietly beneath quilts made from scraps of worn fabric. Their cheeks glow red from cold exposure. One boy rubs his hands together constantly, almost absent-mindedly. No one wastes energy unnecessarily here. Not tonight. You sit carefully on a rough stool beside the dead hearth. The stones still hold the faintest trace of warmth from earlier flames. You place your palms near them hopefully. The heat barely exists now. Outside, wind brushes softly against the cabin walls. The sound resembles fingers moving across dry paper. Many settlers feared winter silence more than storms themselves. During blizzards, at least the noise distracted the mind. Calm winter nights often felt stranger because every tiny sound carried through the frozen wilderness. A cracking branch could seem dangerously close. Animal footsteps became unsettling mysteries in darkness. You hear one of the logs in the wall shift slightly with a low wooden groan. The cabin settles constantly during cold weather. Timber contracts as temperatures fall. Some pioneers described hearing loud cracking sounds during severe freezes, almost like distant gunfire across the forest. A few believed spirits wandered outside during such nights. Folk beliefs travelled easily across isolated settlements where darkness lasted long and explanations remained scarce. You pull your coat tighter. The woman at the table finally speaks softly about tomorrow's weather. Snow may continue through morning. That means deeper drifts near the tree line and slower travel for anyone gathering wood. A historical account from frontier settlements in Minnesota described families rationing firewood carefully during harsh winters, because fresh snow buried fallen branches too deeply to retrieve easily. Tonight feels dangerously familiar to them. The youngest child yawns quietly beside the wall. Soon everyone must attempt sleep despite the cold. Rest mattered deeply on the frontier because every day demanded physical labour. Yet sleeping without fire created its own difficulties. Fingers numbed, faces stiffened painfully. Moisture inside blankets froze slowly through the night from ordinary breathing. You glance upward toward the ceiling, beams darkened by years of tow. Animal skins hang drying near one corner. A kettle rests beside the empty hearth. Every object inside the cabin appears practical. Nothing decorative survives easily in places where survival already requires constant effort. A curious detail from several frontier diaries reveals that some settlers slept wearing nearly all their clothing during winter nights without fire. Boots sometimes remained on as well. Removing them risked discovering frozen leather by morning. You understand why immediately. Cold settles deeper now. The light outside fades steadily through tiny gaps in the walls. Shadows spread across the cabin floor. Someone lights a small tallow candle near the table. Its weak yellow glow barely reaches the corners of the room. The flame flickers constantly whenever drafts slip through unseen cracks. The smell changes slightly. Melted animal fat fills the air with a thick, greasy scent. You hear stomachs growling quietly nearby. Supper was thin tonight. Salt pork, watered stew and coarse bread often formed ordinary winter meals for frontier families. Historians continue debating whether some isolated settlements faced worse nutritional shortages than official records suggest. Many personal diaries softened difficult experiences out of pride or simple habit. Still, the tired faces around you reveal enough. The woman folds extra quilts carefully near the sleeping area. Layers matter more than comfort now. Straw mattresses help slightly by trapping warm air beneath the body. Fur blankets provide better insulation than woven fabric alone. Buffalo hides were especially valued across colder frontier regions because they retained warmth surprisingly well even during severe freezes. You move toward the sleeping space slowly. The cabin floor creaks beneath every step. Your body already anticipates the cold waiting inside those blankets. Sleep without fire becomes less about comfort and more about endurance. Outside, night finally arrives across the wilderness. The forest disappears beyond the frosted windows. Only darkness remains there now. A distant howl drifts faintly between the trees. Probably wolves, told the wolves, though perhaps only wind moving strangely through frozen branches. Frontier travellers often admitted difficulty separating real sounds from imagined fears during long winter nights. Exhaustion changed the mind. Darkness enlarged every uncertainty. You settle beneath several heavy quilts beside the wall. The fabric feels rough against your chin. Cold air slips through the blankets almost immediately. Another person lies nearby for shared warmth. Families commonly slept close together during harsh weather because body heat sometimes replaced failing fires entirely. The candlelight grows softer. The cabin quiets gradually. You listen to breathing, shifting blankets, and the endless whisper of winter pressing against the logs outside. Sleep will come slowly tonight. The cold refuses to let the body relax fully. Still, morning always mattered more than comfort here. You close your eyes while frost quietly forms along the edges of the cabin walls. The last warmth of supper still lingers faintly inside your stomach as darkness settles completely around the cabin. It is not a satisfying warmth, more a memory of warmth. The thin stew disappeared quickly from the bowls, leaving behind only the smell of boiled onions, salt pork, and damp wooden spoons. You can still smell it in the air. Frontier meals during winter rarely looked impressive. Many families survived on preserved food for months after harvest season ended. Cornmeal, smoked meat, dried beans, and root vegetables became ordinary companions during long cold stretches. Fresh food nearly vanished once deep snow covered the land. The candle beside the table flickers weakly. Its small flame casts uneven shadows across the walls, making the cabin appear larger one moment and strangely narrow the next. Every moving shadow catches your attention now that the fire is gone. Cold changes how people notice things. The rough blanket across your chest feels heavier. Your ears search constantly for unfamiliar sounds. Even your breathing seems louder inside the stillness. A child coughs softly from the far side of the room. The mother immediately adjusts another quilt around his shoulders. Small gestures matter deeply here. Historians studying frontier households often note how carefully families managed blankets during winter. Quilts represented labor survival and protection all at once. Some women spent months sewing scraps of fabric together by candlelight simply to create another layer against freezing nights. You pull your own blanket closer beneath your chin. The wool scratches slightly against your skin. Despite the roughness, you're grateful for its weight. Without fire, warmth must remain trapped carefully beneath every layer possible. The cabin grows colder steadily, not suddenly. That's the dangerous part. The temperature falls slowly enough that exhaustion tricks the body into accepting discomfort little by little. First your fingers stiffen, then your feet begin losing warmth inside heavy socks. Eventually the cold settles into your shoulders and jaw until even relaxing feels difficult. Outside wind brushes snow across the roof with a soft dragging sound. You picture the drifts building slowly beside the cabin walls. In many frontier settlements, snow piled so deeply during winter that doors became partially blocked overnight. Some families kept shovels indoors because morning exits occasionally required digging through packed drifts before daylight chores could begin. A man near the doorway mutters quietly about tomorrow's wood supply. Not enough remains. That fact hangs silently inside the room for several moments. Everyone understands the meaning immediately, see? More wood means longer exposure outside. More exposure means greater danger if storms worsen. You notice how carefully people conserve movement now. Nobody paces unnecessarily. Nobody wastes effort shifting around the room. Frontier survival depended heavily upon preserving energy during winter months. Calories disappeared quickly in freezing weather, especially when food supplies ran low. The candle crackles softly. A small bead of melted tallow slides down its side. You stare toward the dark hearth again. Earlier that afternoon, flames filled the room with orange light and snapping sounds. The difference feels enormous now. One missing fire changes the entire spirit of the cabin. An interesting account from early Appalachian settlements claimed some families heated stones beside fires before bedtime, then wrapped them in cloth beneath blankets. The stones released warmth slowly through the night. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly became across frontier regions, though personal journals mention similar methods occasionally during severe winters. Unfortunately, tonight no fire remains hot enough for heated stones, only ashes. You listen carefully to the cabin itself. The logs continue shifting with tiny groans as temperatures fall further outside. One sharp crack echoes suddenly from the forest beyond the walls. Then silence again. Trees sometimes split violently during intense freezes. Moisture inside the timber expands and contracts under brutal temperature changes. Travelers crossing northern territories occasionally described hearing entire forests popping throughout the night like distant musket fire. A pleasant thought before sleep. You close your eyes briefly. The darkness behind your eyelids feels almost warmer than the room itself. Nearby, someone whispers a quiet story to the children. Frontier parents often use stories practically during winter evenings. Tales distracted frightened minds from hunger storms or bitter cold. Folklore travelled easily through isolated communities where books remained rare and entertainment depended mostly upon memory. The voice stays soft and steady. You only catch fragments, something about a hunter lost during heavy snow, something about strange tracks beside a frozen river. Children listen carefully despite obvious exhaustion. Fear and curiosity often sit side by side during winter nights. Your toes ache slightly now. You shift beneath the blankets trying to trap warmer air around your legs. It helps for perhaps 30 seconds before the cold slips back again through tiny openings near your shoulders. A mainstream historical observation from frontier settlements reveals that many cabins lacked proper flooring entirely during earlier expansion periods. Dirt floors remained common in poorer households. Fortunately, this cabin at least contains rough wooden planks beneath you, though icy drafts still rise between the gaps. You hear mice somewhere near the far wall, small scratching noises, tiny survivors sharing the cabin. Rodents frequently invaded winter cabins searching for grain warmth or scraps of food. Settlers complained constantly about them in journals and letters. Some nights the scratching became so persistent that proper sleep felt impossible. The mother finally blows out the candle. Darkness swallows the room immediately. Complete darkness. Only faint moonlight enters through thin cracks between the logs. Your eyes adjust slowly, revealing vague shapes beneath piles of blankets around the cabin. The cold feels sharper without light. Strange how that happens. You breathe slowly through your nose, trying to warm the air before it reaches your lungs. Experienced frontiersmen often recommended this habit during severe weather because freezing air irritated the throat painfully after hours of exposure. Another distant howl drifts across the wilderness. Longer this time. Perhaps wolves truly are nearby tonight. Wolves rarely attacked cabins directly, yet their sounds carried enormous emotional weight across frontier settlements. Many settlers associated wolf howls with isolation itself. The sound reminded them how distant civilization remained beyond the frozen woods. You wonder briefly how many other cabins sit hidden beneath snow tonight. How many families lie awake listening to similar winds? How many fires have already gone dark? The thought feels strangely comforting. A peculiar frontier superstition once claimed that sleeping beside an extinguished hearth invited wandering spirits into the cabin before dawn. Scholars remain uncertain where this belief originated, though versions appeared in scattered folklore, from immigrant communities moving westward. Long winter nights encouraged unusual ideas. Isolation often shaped imagination as much as survival. Your body curls tighter beneath the blankets instinctively. Heat matters more now. Someone nearby begins snoring lightly. Another person shifts restlessly against creaking straw bedding. The cabin smells increasingly human as hours pass without ventilation. Wool, damp, leather-cooled stew animal fur and frozen air combine into a heavy frontier scent difficult to describe cleanly. Not pleasant, exactly, but familiar. You feel sleep approaching slowly despite the cold resistance inside your muscles. Exhaustion eventually overpowers discomfort for most settlers. Physical labour drained the body too deeply during winter months. Still, true rest rarely came easily without fire. You open your eyes once more toward the invisible ceiling beams overhead. Frost thickens quietly along the walls. Your own breath contributes to it with every passing minute. Outside, snow continues falling softly across the endless black wilderness. Inside, the cabin waits patiently for morning. Somewhere during the deepest part of the night, you stop thinking about comfort entirely. The goal changes. Now you simply want to stay warm enough until morning. Your eyes open slowly inside the darkness. For several moments you cannot tell how much time has passed. Frontier nights often felt endless during winter because darkness arrived early and lingered heavily across the land. Without clocks nearby, settlers judged the passing hours mostly through instinct moonlight or the simple exhaustion inside their bodies. The cabin feels colder than before. Much colder. You pull the blankets tighter immediately, but pockets of icy air have already slipped beneath the layers. Your nose feels numb. One side of your face aches faintly from exposure where it rested too near the outer wall. The quilts covering you smell of old wool and faint smoke trapped from earlier fires. Their rough texture scratches gently against your chin whenever you move. Frontier bedding rarely felt luxurious. Most families used whatever materials remained available after harvest seasons, trading journeys, or hunting trips. You shift carefully beside the others sleeping nearby. Shared warmth matters now more than personal space. Historical descriptions from frontier settlements frequently mention entire families sleeping close together during severe winters. Children lay between adults. Extra blankets covered everyone collectively. Body heat became another survival tool almost as valuable as food or dry firewood. A child murmurs softly in sleep beside you. Then silence returns. Outside, the wind has strengthened. You hear snow brushing steadily against the cabin walls with a dry whispering sound. Occasionally stronger gusts rattle the roof overhead, sending faint dust downward from the ceiling beams. The cabin answers every movement of the storm. Timber creaks. Floorboards' tones complain softly. Loose pegs inside the walls click faintly against shrinking wood. You understand why many settlers develop strong superstitions during winter isolation. A dark cabin produced endless strange noises after midnight. Every sound invited imagination. A small opening near the corner wall catches your attention suddenly. Pale moonlight enters through the crack in a narrow silver line. More importantly, cold air slips through continuously. You can feel it reaching your blanket from several feet away. Some frontier families stuffed cabin walls with clay moss, newspaper scraps, animal fur, or even dried corn husks to reduce drafts. Yet no cabin remained completely sealed during harsh winters. Gaps always returned once wood expanded during summer heat and shrank again in freezing weather. You tuck your hands beneath your arms for warmth. Your fingers remain stiff. An old frontier saying claimed that winter cabins taught patience better than churches ever could. Sitting quietly through freezing darkness required tremendous endurance, especially when storms prevented travel for days at a time. You hear the mother awake nearby, not fully moving, just listening. Parents on the frontier often slept lightly during dangerous weather. Illness spread quickly through poorly heated cabins, especially among children. Pneumonia, influenza, and fever frightened isolated families because doctors rarely lived nearby. Some settlements waited days or weeks for medical help during severe storms. The boy beside the wall coughs again, a dry sound. The mother adjusts blankets around him gently before settling once more into tilance. You close your eyes, briefly hoping sleep will return. Instead, your attention drifts towards smaller details around the cabin. The smell of damp leather near the doorway. The faint odor of animal hide hanging from ceiling pegs. The stale scent of cooled ashes resting inside the hearth. Even the air tastes cold. A quirky detail from frontier journals reveals that some settlers slept wearing knitted caps indoors because so much body heat escaped through the head during freezing nights. Others wrapped scarves loosely around their faces while sleeping to protect their noses from frostbite near poorly insulated walls. You consider doing the same now. Your ears burn painfully from exposure despite the blankets. Outside, another distant cracking sound echoes through the woods. Perhaps another frozen tree splitting somewhere beyond the hills. The noise lingers strangely across the quiet landscape before fading entirely. Then comes the silence again. Deep winter silence feels different from ordinary quiet. Snow absorbs smaller sounds. Frozen air carries distant noises farther across the wilderness. A single animal call can seem hauntingly close despite miles of forest between you and it. You slowly adjust the straw mattress beneath your body. The straw shifts with the dry rustling noise. Primitive bedding often used straw-dried grass or corn husks stuffed into cloth sacks. Comfortable at first perhaps, less pleasant after months of use. The mattress beneath you feels uneven now, lumpy. One sharp piece of straw presses through the fabric near your shoulder. You move slightly to avoid it. Small discomforts become enormous during sleepless winter nights. A man near the doorway suddenly sits upright beneath his blankets. For one tense second, everyone listens. Then comes the sound. Something brushes lightly against the outer wall. Perhaps snow falling from nearby branches. Perhaps an animal moving beside the cabin. Frontier settlers frequently dealt with curious foxes, raccoons, or wandering livestock during winter storms. Yet imagination often transformed harmless sounds into far more dramatic possibilities after midnight. The noise fades quickly. The man settles back down. Nobody speaks. A historical observation from northern frontier settlements suggests that cabins built from green timber often performed worse during winter than older structures. Fresh logs contained more moisture and shifted heavily during seasonal freezing. Cabins built quickly during expansion periods frequently trapped settlers inside drafty shelters for years before repairs improved conditions. This cabin certainly feels imperfect enough. You study the faint moonlight near the wall crack again. Frost has formed delicate patterns across the inner log surrounding it. Tiny white crystals spread slowly outward like frozen spiderwebs. Beautiful in a miserable sort of way. Your breathing deepens gradually. At last, fatigue begins softening the sharp edge of discomfort. Frontier labor exhausted people physically in ways modern life rarely does. Carrying water, chopping wood, tending animals, hauling supplies through snow and repairing cabins consumed enormous energy daily. Eventually, even cold loses arguments against exhaustion. Still, your feet remain frustratingly cold beneath the blankets. You rub them together slowly for warmth. Many settlers slept with heated bricks or stones near their feet whenever fires allowed it. Tonight there are no heated stones waiting beneath the quilts, only stubborn winter air. Historians continue questioning exactly how often frontier families experienced dangerously low indoor temperatures during severe winters. Personal diaries sometimes exaggerated hardships for dramatic storytelling, while others minimized suffering entirely. Pride shaped many pioneer recollections. Survival itself became part of personal identity. Yet moments like this require no exaggeration. The cold feels honest enough already. A faint glow appears suddenly through the wall cracks. Not sunrise. Moonlight reflecting brighter across fresh snow outside. The entire wilderness beyond the cabin must shine pale silver beneath the winter sky now. You imagine the frozen forest stretching endlessly beyond sight. Silent rivers trapped beneath thick ice. Snow-buried trails disappearing between dark trees. Isolated cabins scattered miles apart across the frontier darkness. Tiny islands of human warmth, or at least attempts at warmth. Your eyelids grow heavier again. The storm outside weakens slightly. Wind softens against the roof. The cabin creaks less often now that temperatures have steadied for the night. Beside you, slow breathing fills the darkness. The sound becomes strangely comforting. You pull the blankets one final inch closer around your shoulders and allow yourself to drift slowly back toward uneasy sleep while frost continues spreading silently across the frozen cabin walls. You wake suddenly without understanding why. For a few confused moments, the darkness feels complete and endless. Your body remains still beneath the blankets while your mind slowly catches up with the cold reality surrounding you. Then you feel it. The air has grown even colder. Your breath escapes in pale clouds directly before your face. Tiny crystals glitter faintly in the moonlight leaking through the cabin walls. The inside of the cabin now resembles a shallow ice cave more than a home. Somewhere nearby, someone shifts beneath heavy quilts. The straw mattress rustles softly. You pull your stiff hands closer beneath your chest, trying to recover warmth inside your fingers. They ache sharply now. Not unbearable pain, just the dull, persistent discomfort that settles into the body after many hours without proper heat. A thin layer of frost coats the blanket near your mouth. You notice it immediately. Each breath leaves behind moisture that freezes gradually against the rough wool fabric. Early travelers across northern territories occasionally described waking with ice forming on their bedding after particularly brutal nights. One trader from the upper Midwest wrote that his beard froze solid against his blanket while sleeping beside an extinguished fire. Not exactly the peaceful cabin scenes painted in later frontier artwork. The room smells colder now, too. That sounds impossible, perhaps. Yet winter cabins truly carried different scents after midnight. Damp wood, frozen cloth, cooled ashes, and stale air combined into something dry and sharp. Even breathing felt different. The cold stripped moisture from the air until your throat tightened slightly with every slow inhale. Outside, the wilderness remained silent. No wolves, no wind either. Only deep frozen stillness pressing against the cabin walls from every direction. You slowly raise your head enough to study the room. Moonlight reflects softly across the frost spreading along the logs. It gathers thickest near the cracks where icy air continues slipping through. The silver glow makes everything appear strangely delicate. Beautiful in a harsh way. The mother near the far wall is awake again. You can tell by the faint movement beneath her blankets. Parents on the frontier rarely enjoyed uninterrupted sleep during winter. Every cough, every unusual sound, every sudden drop in temperature demanded attention. The youngest child whimpers softly in sleep. She places a hand gently across his shoulder until he settles once more. Records from isolated settlements reveal that children often slept surprisingly deeply despite difficult conditions. Adults worried constantly about freezing temperatures. Younger children sometimes adapted more easily through pure exhaustion. Their bodies simply surrendered to sleep after long days of chores and cold exposure. You envy them slightly. Your own feet remain painfully cold. You flex your toes beneath thick socks, though the motion barely helps anymore. Some settlers filled cloth bags with warm ashes before bed and tucked them near their feet beneath blankets. Others heated iron pans beside the fire before wrapping them carefully in fabric. Little frontier tricks passed from family to family through long winters. Tonight there were no spare ashes warm enough for such luxuries, only darkness. You hear a soft cracking sound from above, ice perhaps, or shrinking wood. Cabins never truly rested during winter nights. Roof beams shifted constantly beneath changing temperatures. Nails loosened. Logs settled unevenly. In severe weather, entire walls occasionally developed fresh gaps before morning arrived. One overlooked detail from pioneer journals describes settlers waking repeatedly to brush snow away from indoor windowsills because drifting powder slipped through tiny openings overnight. Winter always found a path inside eventually. The moonlight brightened suddenly across the floorboards. Clouds must have cleared outside. You imagine the snowfields surrounding the cabin, glowing beneath the open sky now. The forest standing motionless beneath silver light. Frozen branches sparkling faintly in the distance. Cold landscapes often appeared most beautiful, precisely when survival became hardest. A nearby sleeper coughs heavily into the darkness. The sound lingers too long. Illness frightened frontier families more during winter than almost any other danger. A broken wagon could be repaired eventually. A poor harvest might improve next season. Severe sickness inside an isolated cabin during deep winter brought uncertainty of another kind entirely. You listen carefully afterward. No further coughing comes. That feels reassuring somehow. Your shoulder presses against the outer wall accidentally. The cold from the logs shocks straight through your blanket. You pull away immediately. The timber itself feels nearly frozen now. Modern historians continue debating how accurately later frontier memoirs described winter suffering. Some accounts likely became exaggerated over time. Others probably softened harsh experiences for younger readers. Yet surviving physical evidence from early cabins confirms how primitive many structures truly were. Tiny shelters, thin walls, long winters. No amount of nostalgia changes that. A faint smell of pine drifts briefly through the cabin. Someone must have stuffed evergreen branches into a wall crack earlier in the season for insulation. Certain settlers believed pine branches freshened stale winter air indoors as well. Whether they truly improved conditions remains uncertain though. The scent probably lifted spirits slightly during dark months. You hear mice again behind the storage barrels. Persistent little creatures. Frontier households fought constant battles against rodents during winter. Grain stores attracted them immediately. Some cabins kept cats almost entirely for this reason. Other families set crude traps near food supplies each evening before sleep. The scratching stops suddenly. Perhaps the mice hear you moving. Perhaps they simply found something interesting to chew elsewhere. Comforting frontier mystery. Your body grows heavier beneath the blankets despite the cold discomfort surrounding you. Fatigue spreads slowly through your muscles again. Frontier labor shapes sleep differently than modern exhaustion. People collapsed into rest because survival demanded physical effort every single day. Even terrible sleep remained necessary sleep. A strange frontier belief from certain northern settlements warned against speaking too confidently about surviving winter before spring actually arrived. Harsh storms humbled families quickly. Boasting about endurance supposedly tempted misfortune itself. You understand the caution. The cabin already feels fragile against the frozen wilderness outside. One strong storm could change everything here. A nearby log pops softly as temperatures continue falling. Frost near the wall crack thickens visibly now, spreading in feathery white patterns across the timber. Your own eyelashes feel slightly stiff each time you blink. You laugh quietly to yourself, very quietly. Imagine explaining this romantic frontier adventure to someone sitting comfortably beside a modern heater. Covered wagons, log cabins, untouched forests, such charming imagery during daylight. Less charming at 3 a.m. while your nose freezes indoors. The thought almost warms you. Almost. You settle deeper beneath the blankets beside the others. Shared body heat still lingers faintly within the crowded bedding. The air outside the quilts feels brutally cold now by comparison. Your breathing slows gradually. The moonlight softens again behind drifting clouds. Somewhere beyond the frozen walls, snow slips gently from heavy pine branches onto the silent ground below. The wilderness continues through darkness without concern for the tiny cabin hidden within it. And slowly, despite the cold pressing against every inch of the room, sleep begins reaching for you once more. At some point before dawn, snow begins slipping beneath the cabin door. You notice it first against the floorboards. A faint pale shape stretches slowly across the dark wood near the entrance. For several sleepy seconds, your tired mind struggles to understand what you're seeing. Then another thin gust rattles the door softly, carrying loose powder through the uneven gap below. The storm outside has returned, not violently, just steadily. You remain curled beneath the blankets while cold air drifts across the cabin floor in slow, invisible waves. It reaches the bedding, gradually touching your boots first, then your legs beneath the quilts. Winter cabins possess countless weaknesses. Doors were often among the worst. Many frontier cabins use simple wooden planks held together with iron nails or leather hinges. Proper insulation rarely existed around the frame. During severe weather, snow entered easily through cracks and warped boards. Families stuffed cloth straw or animal fur beneath doors whenever possible. Apparently not enough tonight. The mother rises quietly from her bedding. You hear her footsteps crossing the floor with careful slowness. Every board creaks beneath her weight. She kneels beside the door and presses folded cloth against the widening gap near the threshold. The effort helps slightly. Still tiny streams of snow continue swirling inward whenever stronger gusts strike the cabin. She sighs softly. Not frustration exactly. More like tired acceptance. Frontier life demanded endless small battles against weather. Hunger, leaks, mud, smoke, insects, sickness, and cold, very few problems disappear completely. Most were simply managed one difficult day at a time. You watch her return beneath the blankets beside the children. The room settles into silence again. Outside wind moves through the trees with a deeper voice now. The sound rises and falls slowly across the wilderness, almost like distant ocean waves. You imagine the forest bending beneath heavy snow while branches scrape against one another high above the frozen ground. The cabin smells damp tonight. Snow melting near the doorway adds moisture to the stale winter air. Wet wool contributes its own earthy scent as well. Somewhere beneath it all lingers the faint odour of old smoke trapped inside the logs from countless earlier fires. Travel journals from northern settlements often complained about constant dampness during winter months. Melting snow soaked boots, gloves, blankets, and clothing repeatedly. Dry fabric became precious during long storms. Wet cloth against freezing skin could quickly become dangerous. You pull your blanket away from the floor carefully. No reason inviting more cold upward. A tiny draft brushes your cheek from another crack in the wall nearby. You can almost trace the cabin's weak points now without looking. Each opening carries its own current of icy air. Some arrive sharp and direct, Others drift softly across the room like invisible rivers. One detail frequently mentioned in Frontier letters involved frost collecting inside cabins around nailheads or metal tools hanging near walls. Iron conducted cold rapidly through thin timber. Settlers sometimes woke to find small rings of ice surrounding every exposed metal surface indoors. You glance toward a lantern hook beside the hearth. Sure enough, frost sparkles faintly around the iron nail holding it. The sight feels oddly beautiful despite everything. A child stirs beside you suddenly and mutters sleepily about snow. The mother whispers reassurance almost immediately. Her voice stays low and calm, though exhaustion weighs heavily beneath each word. Parents became experts at sounding confident while deeply worried. The wind strikes harder against the cabin. Snow rattles briefly across the roof overhead. One loose board vibrates somewhere near the chimney with an irritating wooden buzz. You wonder how many winters this structure has already survived. Not every Frontier cabin lasted long. Some collapsed beneath snow weight. Others rotted from moisture or warped badly after repeated freezing seasons. Settlers rebuilt constantly during westward expansion, because temporary shelters often became permanent far longer than intended. You flex your fingers again beneath the blankets, still stiff. Still aching. The cold no longer surprises you now. Instead, it settles into the background like an unpleasant companion sitting quietly beside the bed. A curious winter practice from isolated settlements involved hanging extra blankets directly across interior walls to trap warmth more effectively. Some families even nailed quilts over windows during severe weather. The cabins became darker and more crowded afterward, though slightly easier to heat. This cabin clearly lacks enough spare fabric for such luxuries. Moonlight still slips through too many cracks. Your stomach growls faintly. Cold weather consumed energy rapidly. Frontier diets struggled to keep pace during difficult winters, especially when hunting failed, or supply routes disappeared beneath snow. Salt pork and coarse bread filled stomachs temporarily, but rarely satisfied the body completely during months of heavy labor. The family near you likely understands hunger far better than they discuss openly. You hear the father shifting near the hearth. He rises, carefully wraps a coat around his shoulders and kneels beside the ashes. For one hopeful moment you wonder whether hidden embers survive beneath the grey dust. He searches quietly with a small stick. Nothing, only cold ash. After several seconds he sits motionless before the dead fire. Moonlight catches the tired lines across his face. No anger appears there, only calculation. Measuring tomorrow's work already. Estimating remaining wood, wondering how deep the drifts may become by morning. Winter turned ordinary people into constant planners. Poor preparation carried consequences quickly. Researchers studying frontier survival patterns note that firewood shortages appeared repeatedly in winter diaries, especially during unexpected storms. Snow buried fallen timber. Wet wood burned poorly. Long travel distances exhausted men already weakened by cold and limited food. The father finally returns to his bedding without speaking. Nobody asks questions. The answer already sits frozen inside the hearth. Outside, the storm slowly eases again. Wind fades gradually between the trees until only loose snow continues brushing against the walls. The quiet afterward feels strangely enormous. You listen to the small sounds remaining inside the cabin instead. Slow breathing, occasional coughing, blankets rustling softly, water dripping near the doorway where snow has partially melted beside warmer indoor air. Simple sounds, human sounds. For a brief moment the cabin almost feels peaceful despite the cold. The crowded bedding, the shared silence, the stubborn endurance surrounding you in darkness. Not comfortable, but peaceful. A bit of frontier folklore once warned against sweeping cabin floors during nighttime storms because the act supposedly invited stronger winds outdoors. Historians remain uncertain whether anyone truly believed such stories literally, though many isolated communities developed small rituals around weather and survival. Perhaps people simply liked feeling some control over impossible winters. You understand the impulse. The snow beneath the door has stopped growing now. The cloth barrier finally holds well enough against the drifting powder. Frost continues thickening near the walls, turning parts of the cabin silver-white beneath fading moonlight. Your eyelids grow heavy again. The storm moves farther into the wilderness beyond the trees. The cabin creaks softly as temperatures continue falling toward dawn. And somewhere beneath the blankets, surrounded by cold timber and sleeping bodies, you drift once more toward uneasy frontier sleep. The silence outside eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Not because it grows louder, because it grows deeper. You wake again sometime before dawn, though the darkness remains unchanged inside the cabin. The storm has passed entirely now. No wind brushes the roof, no snow rattles against the walls. The wilderness beyond the cabin feels frozen into complete stillness. That stillness unsettles you more than the storm did. You lie motionless beneath the blankets, listening carefully. The cabin itself has grown quieter too. The timber no longer groans as often. Even the mice behind the storage barrels seem to have disappeared into sleep or hiding. Only human breathing remains, slow, uneven, occasionally interrupted by soft coughing. The cold presses heavily against your face. You tuck your chin deeper beneath the blanket and inhale the stale warmth trapped there. The fabric smells faintly of damp wool and old smoke. Not pleasant exactly, yet oddly comforting after so many freezing hours. Outside, something cracks sharply in the distance. You tense immediately. The sound echoes through the frozen woods before fading back into silence. Most likely another tree splitting under the cold. Winter temperatures could turn entire forests brittle during severe freezes. Travelers crossing northern territories often described hearing sudden cracks across the landscape late at night. Still, your imagination offers less comforting possibilities first. That is how darkness works. A child nearby shifts suddenly in sleep, brushing against your arm beneath the blankets. His small body radiates surprising warmth. Families sleeping together through winter nights often created pockets of trapped heat beneath shared bedding. Without realizing it, entire households formed living barriers against freezing air. The arrangement feels cramped. Necessary too. A surviving letter from an Iowa settler once described waking during winter to find frost covering the inside walls so thickly that children traced shapes into it with their fingers before breakfast. Another account from frontier Wisconsin mentioned ice forming beneath beds where drafts slipped through loose floorboards. The frontier rarely cared about romantic expectations. You glance toward the dark outline of the hearth again. Still dead. Still cold. Ashes rest silently beneath pale moonlight leaking through the cracks. The sight almost feels insulting now. Fire represented safety in ways difficult to explain fully. Once flames vanished, the cabin transformed into little more than a thin wooden shell standing between human bodies and endless winter darkness. You hear a distant howl again, longer this time. The sound drifts faintly across the frozen wilderness, soft enough that you almost mistake it for wind at first. Another howl answers somewhere farther away. Wolves, almost certainly wolves now. Most frontier families feared wolves far less than later stories suggested. Attacks on cabins remained rare. Livestock faced greater danger than people. Yet hearing wolves during freezing darkness still affected the mind deeply. Their calls reminded settlers how isolated they truly were. You picture the animals moving silently through the snowy forest beneath moonlight. Lean bodies, white breath, sharp paws pressing into untouched drifts. Then silence swallows the sound again. The father near the hearth is awake once more. You hear him shifting quietly beneath his blankets. Perhaps the wolves disturbed him too. Perhaps the cold simply refuses to let him sleep deeply anymore. You understand that feeling. Your shoulder aches from lying too long in one position, yet leaving the warm pocket beneath the blankets feels impossible. The air outside them bites immediately against exposed skin. Some winter journals from remote settlements mentioned settlers sleeping in shifts beside fires during especially dangerous weather. One person stayed awake tending flames while others rested. The arrangement reduced the risk of frozen cabins by morning. Unfortunately, such plans depended entirely upon having enough firewood available. Tonight there is nothing left to tend, only waiting. A strange little frontier custom involved hanging animal skins directly over doorways during severe cold snaps. Deer hide, buffalo hide, even old bear pelts sometimes acted as extra barriers against drafts. Travelers occasionally joked that entering winter cabins felt like pushing through layers of sleeping animals. You almost wish this cabin had adopted the idea. The door still leaks cold constantly despite the cloth barrier. Your nose burns slightly now whenever you inhale. The sensation reminds you how dry the air has become. Freezing weather stole moisture from everything. Skin cracked, lips split painfully. Wooden bowls shrank and warped beside cold walls. Even the silence feels dry somehow. You study the faint moonlight reaching across the floorboards. Tiny bits of frost sparkle near the doorway where drifting snow entered earlier. The sight resembles scattered salt across dark wood. Beautiful again. Winter keeps doing that, making terrible conditions look strangely lovely under moonlight. The mother coughs quietly into her blanket. Not severe, just tired. Long winters wore down the body gradually. Smoke inhalation from cabin fires irritated lungs constantly. Combined with cold air and crowded sleeping conditions, sickness spread easily once one person became ill. Medical help remained dangerously distant for many settlements. Certain frontier families relied heavily upon herbal remedies passed through generations. Pine needle tea appeared often in winter accounts because it contained valuable nutrients during months without fresh produce. Onion syrup, heated vinegar and mustard poultices also appeared in scattered household records. Whether all those remedies truly helped remains uncertain. Still, people needed hope almost as much as medicine. You shift carefully again beneath the blankets. Your feet remain cold despite every effort. The discomfort no longer shocks you now. Instead, it settles into the body like background noise. Constant, persistent, impossible to fully ignore. The wolves howl once more. Farther away this time, the sound drifts across frozen hills before dissolving into silence. You imagine other cabins hearing the same distant calls tonight. Other tired families curled beneath blankets beside dying hearths. The frontier connected strangers through shared discomfort more than shared distance. A small piece of ice suddenly falls from the wall near the window crack, tapping softly against the floorboards. Frost has thickened enough indoors to break loose now. That realization feels absurd. Ice falling inside your bedroom. You almost laugh again. Frontier life contained endless moments balancing hardship and ridiculousness together. A traveler from the Dakota Territory once joked in his journal that winter cabins allowed people to experience outdoor weather without the inconvenience of actually sleeping outdoors. Fair enough. The moon outside begins slipping behind clouds again. Darkness deepens slowly across the cabin. Shapes blur softer beneath the blankets around you. Your body grows heavier. Exhaustion finally begins overcoming alertness once more. The silence outside remains enormous, yet less threatening now, more distant. The wolves have moved on through the forest. The trees stand frozen beneath pale snow. The cabin continues holding together despite every weakness in its walls. For tonight at least, that will have to be enough. You close your eyes while the cold presses quietly against the logs beyond your blankets, and somewhere between discomfort and exhaustion, sleep reaches you again. The night deepens into a quieter kind of cold, not the sharp cold of storms or wind, but the steady kind that seeps into everything without sound or movement. It settles into the cabin like a patient presence waiting for warmth that no longer exists. You drift in and out of light sleep. Time becomes unclear again. The world inside the cabin feels suspended between moments where even thoughts move slowly as if weighed down by frost. At some point you become aware of bodies around you shifting slightly. The mother adjusts the children again. A blanket is pulled higher over a shoulder. Someone exhales deeply, the breath briefly visible before fading into darkness. The air itself feels thinner now, not in reality but in perception. Cold often creates that illusion. Breathing becomes more deliberate. Every inhale feels slightly more effortful, as though the air must be pulled through layers of invisible resistance. You notice your own heartbeat more clearly than usual. Slow, steady, strangely loud in your chest. Outside, the wilderness has entered its deepest silence. No wind, no animals, no distant cracking of trees. Even the snow seems to have stopped moving. Frontier travelers often describe this phase of winter nights as the most unsettling, when nature felt paused rather than alive. You turn slightly beneath the blankets. The motion sends a brief wave of cold across your shoulders. You immediately regret it. Warmth inside shared bedding is fragile. Once disturbed, it takes time to rebuild. People in early frontier settlements often learn to remain almost completely still during freezing nights to preserve body heat. A small ember of memory returns to you. Earlier fires in cabins like this were never just about cooking or light. They were central to survival. Surviving accounts from homestead regions across the Northern Territories repeatedly mention how families treated fire as a living necessity, carefully feeding it through the night like a guarded resource. Now there is only ash. Somewhere in the darkness, a faint sound emerges again, a slow creak, then another. It is not the cabin collapsing. You recognize it now as timber reacting to temperature shifts. Wood contracts heavily in extreme cold. Nails loosen. Beams settle. The entire structure seems to breathe in its own rigid, frozen way. Still, each sound makes you alert. Your eyes open again. The ceiling is barely visible. Only faint gradients of shadow against darker shadow. The moon has moved further behind clouds, leaving almost no light inside the cabin now. You listen carefully, breathing, occasional rustle of fabric, a soft cough from the far side. Nothing else. Frontier accounts often describe how sound becomes a kind of companion during winter isolation. In the absence of daylight activity, people begin to map their environment through noise alone. The slightest change becomes meaningful. A drop of melted frost falls somewhere near the wall. It taps once against wood, then silence returns. You wonder briefly how many hours remain before morning. Without fire, time becomes harder to judge. Some settlers estimated night length by the stiffness of their bodies, or the gradual exhaustion of patience rather than by any clock. Your body feels heavier now, not only from fatigue but from the cold itself. Muscles tighten unconsciously to conserve heat. Even small movements require effort. A historical pattern observed in many frontier settlements shows that people often slept in cycles during severe winters rather than continuous rest. Short awakenings were common. They would check children, adjust blankets, or simply ensure the fire had not gone out. Tonight there is nothing to check, only endurance. You shift slightly again, this time more carefully. The blanket closest to the wall has grown noticeably colder. You reposition yourself toward the center where shared warmth remains strongest. The human body becomes a heat source in absence of fire, and proximity matters more than comfort. The child beside you murmurs something unintelligible in sleep, a half-formed word, or perhaps just breath-shaped like speech. You notice how small his exhale is, compared to the cold surrounding it. Each breath disappears quickly into the air, swallowed by the room before it can linger. Outside, something moves again, a faint dragging sound across snow, then nothing. You do not react this time. Frontier settlers often recorded similar experiences where night sounds blurred the boundary between animal movement and wind patterns. Wolves, foxes, drifting branches, and shifting ice all created overlapping illusions in darkness. Certainty became less important than endurance. The woman near the wall quietly adjusts her position again. You hear the soft friction of fabric against fabric. Her movements are practiced, careful, almost automatic. People living in such conditions learned efficiency even in sleep. You close your eyes again. This time you do not open them immediately. Thoughts begin to slow. The cold remains present but less intrusive. It becomes something external rather than something actively demanding attention. A subtle memory surfaces from earlier in the night. The faint candlelight. The last moments of warmth. The shared silence before sleep. It feels distant now. Almost like another day entirely. In frontier environments, nights often blurred emotional memory. Exhaustion and temperature shape perception more than time itself. Many personal diaries from settlement regions describe nights that felt longer than entire seasons. Your breathing evens out slightly. The cabin continues its quiet endurance. Wood holds against cold, against wall. Blankets trap what little warmth remains. Bodies share heat without words or movement. Outside the wilderness remains fully still as though the entire world has paused to wait for morning. Your thoughts begin to drift again, less structured now, more fluid. Sleep approaches slowly, not as relief, but as surrender. And in that surrender, the cold finally loses its sharpness, becoming just another layer of the night rather than its defining force. You let yourself sink deeper into the blankets. The cabin remains dark, the wilderness remains silent, and the long winter night continues steady and unbroken. Somewhere in the slow stretch of night, your awareness returns without warning. There is no clear moment of waking, only a gradual resurfacing, as if your mind drifts upward through layers of heavy water until it reaches the thin surface of consciousness again. The first sensation is cold, still present, still patient. It has not changed at all while you are asleep. If anything, it feels more settled now, as though the cabin and the winter outside have agreed on a single shared temperature during the deepest hours before dawn. You remain still for a moment listening. The cabin breathes quietly around you. That is the only way to describe it. The slow expansion and contraction of wood as temperature shifts the soft movement of fabric as bodies shift beneath blankets, the faint sound of distant ice settling somewhere outside. Everything feels muted. Even your thoughts. A frontier winter often erases the sense of clear separation between night and morning. Surviving accounts from early homesteads describe how people sometimes woke unsure whether they had slept for minutes or hours. Without firelight or clocks, time became a vague impression rather than a measurement. You slowly open your eyes. Darkness remains thick inside the cabin, but your vision has adjusted enough to recognize shapes. The faint outline of the hearth, the layered forms of blankets, the soft curve of a sleeping figure near the wall. The moonlight has faded further now. Only a faint greyness seeps through the cracks in the logs, suggesting that night is slowly moving toward its final hours. You feel something different in the air, not warmth, but a slight easing of pressure. The cold is still present, yet it no longer feels like it is increasing. Instead, it has stabilized, reaching its deepest point before dawn begins its slow return. You shift carefully beneath the blankets. The movement sends a brief ripple of cold across your arms. You pause immediately, letting the shared warmth settle again before moving further. Beside you, the child stirs slightly, not waking, just adjusting to position. The mother's hand rests lightly on his back, even in sleep. That small gesture remains constant through the night, as though her body refuses to fully surrender awareness even in exhaustion. Outside, the wilderness is still silent, but now it feels like a different kind of silence. Earlier, it was heavy and absolute. Now it carries a subtle expectation, as though the world itself is waiting for light to return. Frontier travelers often noted this shift in feeling during long winter nights. The final hours before dawn rarely brought new sounds or changes, yet they carried a psychological weight that made sleep more fragile. You breathe slowly. The air feels slightly less harsh than before. Not warmer, just less aggressive. Your body begins to recognize that the worst of the night has passed, even if nothing visible confirms it yet. A faint creak travels through the cabin roof, snow shifting above, or ice loosening from wooden beams. The sound is softer than earlier disturbances. It no longer triggers immediate alertness. Instead, it blends into the background like a familiar part of the structure itself. You think briefly about fire again, not as warmth now, but as memory. How quickly a burning hearth once filled this space with life. How every surface changed under its light. How sound felt different when warmth moved through the room. Surviving homestead journals from northern settlements often describe dawn rituals centered around restarting fire after cold nights. The first spark in the morning held more importance than any meal or conversation that followed. But that is tomorrow. For now, there is only waiting. You adjust your legs slightly. The cold near the edge of the blanket remains sharper than the center. You instinctively move closer towards shared warmth again, careful not to disturb others more than necessary. The room remains still, yet not entirely motionless. Tiny sounds continue beneath the surface of silence. Fabric shifting, slow breathing, a faint settling of snow against the outer wall. Each one barely noticeable on its own, but together forming the quiet rhythm of survival. A memory surfaces again uninvited. Earlier in the evening, when fire still existed, the cabin felt smaller but safer. Light compressed space, shadows were contained. Even fear felt structured and manageable. Now darkness expands everything again, not frightening in the same way anymore, just vast. You close your eyes briefly. Sleep tries to return but does not fully arrive. Instead, you remain in that in-between state where awareness floats lightly above rest, neither fully awake nor fully asleep. Outside, the sky begins its slow transformation, not visible through closed eyes but felt in the atmosphere. The darkest portion of night begins to loosen its grip. The cold remains, but it no longer deepens. Somewhere beyond the forest, the horizon is preparing to change. Frontier settlers often describe this moment as the longest part of the night, even though it technically marked its end. Fatigue made time feel stretched, and anticipation made every minute feel heavier. You inhale slowly. The air still bites slightly, but less than before. Your body relaxes in small increments, responding to signals it does not consciously register. Temperature shifts, subtle light changes. The absence of new disturbances. The cabin continues its quiet endurance, wood holding, fabric resting, bodies sharing warmth. The wilderness outside remains frozen and still but no longer feels entirely closed. Something is coming, not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually as it always has. Morning is approaching, though it has not yet arrived. And in that soft space between darkness and light you remain wrapped in blankets, waiting for the first hint of a new day to reach the frozen cabin walls. The first sign of morning is not light, it is sound. A faint change in the way the cabin holds silence, as if the night itself loosens its grip on the wooden walls. You notice it without fully understanding it, at first still suspended between sleep and waking. Then it becomes clearer. The wilderness outside is no longer completely still. A distant branch shifts somewhere under the weight of snow. Ice releases from the tree with a soft, almost delicate crack. These sounds are not new yet, they feel different now, less like intrusions, and more like the natural resumption of a paused world. You remain under the blankets for a long moment. Warmth is still fragile, but noticeably steadier than in the deepest hours of night. The shared heat inside the bedding feels slightly more reliable, as if the cabin itself is slowly forgiving the long darkness. Your eyes open again. This time the darkness inside the room is not absolute. A faint grey tone seeps through the cracks in the logs, more present than before. It is not yet true daylight, but something softer and in-between glow that suggests the horizon is beginning to shift. You turn your head slightly. The frost along the wall near you appears less sharp now. Earlier it looked crystalline and bright. Now it feels duller, less reflective, as though it is losing some of its night intensity. Breath still rises in visible clouds, but they disperse more quickly. You listen carefully to the room. The mother is awake already. Not speaking, just adjusting blankets with quiet precision. The children remain mostly still, though one of them shifts occasionally with small, sleepy movements. The father lies near the hearth, unmoving for the moment. The dead fire remains unchanged. Ashes lie cold and compact in the stone basin. No hint of ember survives from the previous day. That reality settles into your awareness again, though it no longer feels as sharp as it did during the night. Surviving accounts from frontier settlements often describe this moment before full dawn as deceptive. The body begins to believe relief is arriving, yet the cold still holds power for hours more. Many travelers noted that the final stretch before sunrise often felt the most tiring. You understand that now in a quiet physical way. Your muscles feel heavier than before, not from cold alone, but from long stillness. The kind that builds slowly when movement is limited for many hours. You shift carefully beneath the blankets again. This time the cold does not feel as immediate. It is still present, but it no longer shocks the body in the same way. Familiarity softens its edge. Outside, another sound breaks through the distance. A soft cascade of snow sliding from a branch. Then another. The forest is waking in fragments, not as a whole. Each sound arrives separately, as though the wilderness is remembering how to move again after being frozen in silence. You slowly sit up just enough to observe the room. Shapes are clearer now. The hearth, the table, the hanging hides, the layered bedding along the wall. Everything appears slightly less heavy under the faint grey light. Your breath is still visible, but thinner. The cold is not gone. It has simply stopped deepening. The mother looks toward you briefly. No words are exchanged. There is no need. Everyone in the cabin understands this shared transition. Morning does not arrive with celebration here. It arrives as continuation of survival. A historical pattern noted in many frontier diaries describes how families often remained inside long after dawn, waiting for the air to stabilize slightly before opening doors. The first moments of morning could be nearly as cold as the night itself. You pull the blanket closer once more. The edge near the floor remains the coldest point in the cabin. Snow may still be resting just beyond the threshold. The thought reminds you how thin the barrier truly is between inside and outside. A soft groan travels through the timber above you. This time it feels different, less like strain. More like release. Wood responds slowly to rising temperature changes after long freezes. The structure of the cabin begins to adjust again as night loosens its grip. Tiny movements echo through the beams. You listen to it carefully. It sounds almost like the cabin's vexing. The child beside you opens his eyes briefly. He does not speak, just stares upward into the dimness. Then he closes them again, choosing rest a little longer, while warmth still exists beneath the blankets. Outside light continues to increase gradually, still not direct sunlight, but a spreading softness that begins to reveal faint outlines of trees beyond the walls. The world outside is returning in slow layers rather than sudden brightness. You feel your body responding to this shift. Tension loosens slightly in your shoulders. Breathing becomes easier. Even the cold feels less invasive, though it has not actually changed in temperature yet. It is perception that shifts first. Frontier settlers often describe this psychological relief as more significant than the physical change in weather. Knowing that night had ended mattered almost as much as the actual warmth returning. A faint sound emerges near the doorway. Snow shifting again. Perhaps wind returning gently. Perhaps the forest adjusting itself under changing light. You watch the cracks in the wall more closely now. The frost there appears less active, less bright. It no longer seems to be growing, only existing. The mother finally rises from her bedding, carefully, quietly. She moves toward the hearth again, not with expectation of fire, but with routine. Morning begins with preparation even when nothing has changed yet. She kneels beside the ashes, studies them, then sets them aside for later cleaning. No fire will be made immediately, that much is clear. Wood must still be gathered. Conditions outside must still be assessed. Surviving settlement records often mention how mornings after fireless nights required immediate prioritization of labor. Finding fuel became the first task of the day even before eating or warming properly. You begin to sit up more fully. The blankets slide slightly from your shoulders, releasing a thin wave of colder air that quickly replaces trapped warmth. It is uncomfortable, but not unbearable anymore. The room feels less threatening now, more functional. The father stirs at last, sitting up slowly and scanning the room in silence. His expression carries the familiar calculation of someone already thinking about wood weather and distance to the tree line. The day is beginning to form in his mind. Outside the forest that continues to brighten in gradual stages, snow beyond the walls takes on a faint pale glow, and the long winter night finally loosens its hold on the cabin, leaving behind only the memory of cold and the steady beginning of another difficult frontier morning. Morning does not arrive all at once. It spreads quietly, almost carefully, as if it is unsure whether the cabin is ready to receive it. You notice the change first in the walls. The grey tone outside the cracks becomes slightly warmer, shifting from cold stone-like darkness into a softer, muted blue. The frost no longer sparkles with sharp intensity. It dulls as though surrendering its hold on the night. Inside the cabin, movement begins again. Not hurried, not napiete. Just the slow return of people to wakefulness. The mother is already tending to the children, adjusting blankets with practiced care. The father sits near the hearth, staring at the ashes in a way that suggests thought rather than disappointment. No one speaks yet. Morning on the frontier rarely begins with words. It begins with assessment. Condition of the cold. Condition of the body. Condition of survival for the day ahead. You sit up slowly beneath the blankets. The air immediately feels different against your face, still cold but less aggressive than before. It no longer presses in as deeply. Instead, it lingers at the edges, waiting. Your fingers move slightly. They are stiff but not numb anymore. That small difference feels meaningful. Contemporary settler accounts from northern homesteads often describe this exact moment after fireless nights. The body transitions from defensive survival posture into cautious re-engagement with movement. Muscles begin to loosen those slowly, as if reluctant to trust warmth that is not yet fully present. You glance toward the door. A thin line of light now outlines its edges more clearly. Not direct sunlight, but a pale reflection bouncing across the snow outside. The wilderness has shifted colour, no longer black and silver. Now it carries faint hints of blue and white. The world is returning, gradually. A small sound breaks the quiet. The father finally moves. He stands, wraps his coat tighter, and approaches the door with deliberate steps. Every movement feels measured, conserving energy for what will come next. He pauses briefly before opening it as if preparing himself for the full force of the outside air. Then he opens the door. Cold air rushes in immediately, not violent like, but sharp, clean, undeniably present. A wave of frozen air sweeps across the cabin floor, replacing the stale warmth of shared sleep. You instinctively pull your blanket closer again, even though you are already waking. Outside is brighter than expected. Snow stretches endlessly beyond the threshold, glowing faintly under early light. The trees stand still, their branches heavy with frozen weight. Everything looks calm, but exhaustion still hangs in the air like a memory. The father steps outside briefly, then stops. He looks around the immediate area, likely assessing drift depth, wind direction, and access paths to the tree line. Early homestead records frequently describe how mornings began with this exact silent evaluation of weather conditions before any other task. He returns inside after a short moment. Snow clings to his boots, melting slightly on the wooden floorboards. The cabin now feels colder again due to the open door, but it is a different kind of cold. Not the deep night cold that settled into bones. This is surface cold, temporary, manageable. The door closes. Warmth begins to rebuild slowly outside. The mother starts preparing what little remains of food. Cold bread, perhaps dried meat, maybe a small portion of preserved beans if any are left. Meals like this often defined frontier mornings during winter survival periods. You stand carefully now. Your legs feel unsteady at first, then adjust. Movement returns gradually after long stillness. The body needs time to remember coordination after hours of restricted motion under blankets. A faint sound comes from the hearth as someone shifts ash aside. Still no fire, but preparation begins. Surviving homestead letters from colder northern regions often describe mornings like this as repairing the night. The phrase referred not only to physical tasks but also to emotional recovery from long exposure to cold darkness. You step closer to the center of the cabin. The floor is less icy now, though still chilled. Sunlight begins to filter more strongly through the wall cracks. The frost patterns there look different in daylight, less like delicate crystals and more like residue left behind by absence of heat. The children begin waking more fully. One rubs their eyes slowly. Another sits up without speaking. Their expressions are neutral at first, as though still partially inside the night. Then awareness returns gradually. They begin adjusting blankets, shifting toward their parents, seeking comfort in proximity rather than heat. A subtle detail often found in frontier diaries mentions how children adapted faster to cold conditions than adults in some cases. Their bodies recovered warmth more quickly after rest, though they also became exhausted more easily during long winters. The room feels more alive now. Not warmer, just active again. You notice how sound changes with morning light. Footsteps feel clearer. Fabric movement becomes more distinct. Even breathing no longer disappears instantly into darkness. It lingers slightly longer in the air before fading. The father returns with a small bundle of stored wood. Not much, but enough to begin the process again. He kneels beside the hearth and arranges it carefully over the cold ashes. His movements suggest routine more than urgency. He has likely done this hundreds of times across winters like this. A small flint appears in his hand. The family watches without speaking. Fire-making becomes the center of attention instantly. Not dramatic, but focused. A flicker of hope returns to the room, not through flame yet, but through anticipation of it. Surviving settlement accounts often emphasize how fire creation in the morning carried symbolic weight beyond survival. It marked the transition from endurance to action, from passive suffering to active rebuilding of the day. You lean slightly forward, watching, waiting. The first spark has not yet appeared, but the cabin is no longer frozen in night. It is awake. And so are you. The moment before fire returns always feels longer than it should. Not because anything is delayed, but because everyone inside the cabin is watching a single small possibility decide the shape of the entire day. You stand quietly near the center of the room. Your hands still carry the stiffness of night, but they are slowly becoming responsive again. The cold is no longer something pressing against you from all directions. It has become something you move through, instead of something that holds you in place. The father kneels beside the hearth. He works without ceremony. A small bundle of dry wood is placed carefully over the dead ashes, not rushed, not uncertain. Every motion reflects practiced familiarity. Frontier homestead records frequently describe how fire starting became one of the most essential daily skills, especially in regions where winter lasted for months without pause. He strikes the flint. Once, nothing happens. A faint spark jumps, disappears immediately into the cold air. He tries again. The second strike produces a brighter flicker, but still no lasting flame. You hear the subtle shift in the room. Everyone becomes slightly more still, as if movement might interfere with success. Even the children quiet themselves, watching with wide, tired eyes. A third strike. This time a tiny ember catches briefly on a piece of dry tinder. It glows, weak at first, almost invisible. Then it strengthens slightly. The father leans closer, shielding it with his hands. His breath becomes careful, controlled. Even small drafts inside the cabin could extinguish such a fragile beginning. Contemporary settler journals often describe fire starting as a moment of intense concentration where entire households held their breath for several seconds at a time. Failure meant delay, added cold, and increased risk for the day ahead. The ember grows, slowly, delicately. Then it accepts the wood. A faint orange line appears. Then another. The first real flame rises no higher than a fingertip, but it is enough to change everything inside the cabin. You feel it immediately. Not heat yet, but relief. A psychological shift that precedes physical warmth. The children exhale softly, almost in unison. The mother relaxes her shoulders slightly. The father continues feeding the flame with small pieces of wood, careful not to overwhelm it too quickly. Frontier fire management often required patience during early ignition stages. Too much fuel too soon could smother the fragile spark. The flame strengthens. It grows from orange thread to steady flicker, then to a small but confident fire. Light spreads across the room in soft pulses. Shadows begin to move again, returning depth and shape to the interior. The hearth becomes the center of attention instantly, as it always does after long nights without heat. You step closer. Warmth finally reaches your face. It feels almost unfamiliar at first. Not intense, just present. The smell of burning wood begins to replace the stale cold air inside the cabin. Resin releases faintly from the logs, mixing with the scent of smoke that has not been present since yesterday. Surviving homestead accounts often describe this moment as a kind of rebirth for the household. The fire did not simply warm the room, it redefined it. You extend your hands slightly toward the hearth. Fingers slowly respond. Stiffness begins to loosen. The fire continues growing steadily now, supported by the dry wood stacked carefully by the father. Each log catches in sequence, building structure and stability into the flame. The room becomes visibly brighter. Not just warmer, alive again. The mother begins moving more freely, preparing simple morning food now that heat is available. Cold bread will soften slightly near warmth. Any remaining stew can be reheated. Even small improvements matter after nights like this. The children shift closer to the hearth, carefully, not too close. They understand instinctively the balance between warmth and safety. Early frontier writings often mention how children learned fire distance through observation rather than instruction. You watch the flame for a moment longer. It dances steadily now, no longer fragile. The cabin walls begin to change appearance under the renewed light. Frost near the log starts to dull, slowly losing its crystalline structure. The ice does not vanish immediately, but it begins the long process of retreat. Outside, daylight strengthens further. The snow beyond the door now reflects brighter tones, shifting from pale grey to clearer white. The forest stands motionless in the distance, but no longer feels entirely hostile. It simply exists again. The father finally sits back from the hearth. His expression relaxes slightly, not relief in an emotional sense, more like completion of a necessary task. You notice how the entire cabin has shifted its rhythm. Night was about endurance, morning is about restoration. A detail preserved in many historical settler accounts describes how firelight in the morning often marked the true beginning of labour for the day. Once heat was stable, work could resume outside. Without it, nothing else moved forward. You remain standing near the warmth. Your body adjusts gradually. Cold no longer dominates sensation. Instead, it sits at the edges, waiting to be pushed further away by increasing heat. The mother hands food toward the children. The father checks the fire again. Everyone resumes motion in quiet coordination. No celebration, just continuation. Outside, the wilderness remains unchanged in structure, but softened in perception. Snow still covers everything. Trees still stand frozen, but the fear of absolute night has passed. You breathe more easily now. The fire crackles steadily beside you, and the long winter night that once filled the entire world finally gives way to the simple, persistent return of morning life inside the cabin. Warmth does not arrive evenly. It spreads in layers like memory, returning to a body that has been held too long in cold stillness. You remain close to the hearth, watching the fire strengthen its presence inside the cabin. The flames no longer struggle. They rise with confidence, now bending gently as new wood feeds their steady rhythm. Light fills the space in soft waves, reaching corners that have been swallowed by darkness only hours earlier. Your hands hover near the heat. Slowly sensation returns more fully. First comes tingling, then a gradual loosening of stiffness in the fingers. Frontier survival journals often describe this exact stage after cold nights where the body reacts cautiously to warmth as if unsure whether it's safe to trust it again. The children move closer without being told. Not too close, just near enough to feel the difference in air temperature. Their faces shift subtly as warmth replaces the deep cold they carried through the night. One of them smiles faintly, though no words are spoken. The mother begins preparing what little food remains. Movements become more fluid now that warmth supports her strength. Cold drains effort from even simple tasks, while fire restores efficiency in small but noticeable ways. Historical accounts from homestead kitchens frequently emphasize how morning firelight transforms survival routines into manageable structure. The father tends the fire carefully, adding wood at measured intervals, watching flame behavior closely. Too much fuel too quickly could still weaken the fire rather than strengthen it. Experience teaches patience in these moments. Many early settlers learned this through trial, especially during harsh winters when fire failure meant starting over in freezing conditions. You sit down near the hearth, not fully relaxing yet, just allowing warmth to settle deeper into your body. The difference between night and morning is no longer abstract, it is physical. You feel it in your shoulders, in your breathing, and the slow return of flexibility to your joints. Outside, the cabin light grows stronger. Snow reflects daylight more fully now, creating a soft brightness beyond the door. The forest appears clearer than before, individual tree shapes becoming visible again through the pale winter air. You notice movement outside. The father steps out briefly. The door opens, releasing a short wave of cold air into the cabin before closing again. He pauses outside, likely assessing snow depth and checking immediate conditions near the structure. His return is quick. He brushes snow from his boots near the threshold, careful not to spread moisture further inside. Wet conditions inside cabins were a constant concern during winter months, especially where freezing temperatures could turn small puddles into ice patches overnight. He speaks for the first time that morning, not loudly, just enough to indicate observation. The weather outside is stable, cold but not worsening. That single statement shifts the mood of the room slightly. Stability in frontier winter conditions mattered more than comfort. Predictable cold allowed planning. Unstable weather created risk. He watched the fire again. It burns more steadily now. Logs collapse inward slowly as they are consumed, sending small sparks upward into the rising heat. The sound is consistent and grounding, a contrast to the unpredictable silence of the night. Surviving homestead narratives often describe morning fire as a form of reassurance more than warmth. It signaled continuity. It meant another day had been successfully reached. The mother places a small pot near the edge of the hearth. Water inside begins to warm gradually. Steam rises faintly after a few moments. Simple actions like this define frontier mornings more than any dramatic event. Heat is not only for comfort, it is for restoring function to every part of daily life. You notice your breath no longer appears in front of your face. That change feels surprisingly significant. The absence of visible breath marks the point where cold loses its dominance over perception. The children begin speaking softly to one another. Their voices are still subdued, as if cautious not to disturb the balance of warmth returning to the room. Laughter does not appear yet, but quiet conversation replaces silence. The cabin feels larger now, not physically, but emotionally. Darkness had compressed it during the night, making every corner feel closer and heavier. Morning light expands that, perception again restoring depth and space. A small observation from Frontier Diaries notes that cabins often felt completely different depending on fire presence alone. The same structure could feel like a shelter or a confinement depending on whether warmth existed inside it. You stand once more. Your body responds more easily now. The stiffness that dominated the night has mostly faded. Cold remains present along the floor and near the walls, but it no longer dictates movement. You look toward the doorway again. Light outside is stronger still. The snow appears brighter, almost reflective under the widening morning sky. The forest beyond stands silent, unchanged, but no longer threatening in the same immediate way. The father prepares simple tools near the door, likely planning for wood gathering or repair work. Daily labor resumes quickly in frontier environments after cold nights. Fire restored meant movement restored. Delay was rarely an option when winter conditions demanded constant maintenance. The mother offers a small portion of food, warmed slightly by the fire. It is simple, but enough. You take it slowly, noticing how even basic nourishment feels different after a night of cold endurance. Temperature changes perception of everything, even taste. The fire continues steady behind you. A reliable presence now. Not fragile, not uncertain, just constant. And in that steady return of warmth, the cabin shifts fully from survival mode into the beginning of another winter day. The fire changes everything in the room, even when nothing else moves. You notice it most in the silence. After the long night of stillness, the cabin now carries sound again in a living way. Not just noise, but rhythm. The soft crackle of burning wood. The occasional pop as trapped moisture escapes from the logs. The low shifting of air as heat rises toward the ceiling beams. It feels almost unfamiliar. First, as if you'd forgotten what an inhabited space is supposed to sound like. You remain seated near the hearth, letting warmth spread further into your body. The cold that clung to your bones during the night is still there, but it has begun loosening its grip. Fingers respond more willingly now. Shoulders no longer feel locked in place. The mother moves around the cabin with renewed purpose. She checks the small pot above the fire. Steam rises more steadily now, curling upward in thin trails that disappear into the warm air above. Simple food, once cold and unappealing, now becomes something the body welcomes again. Surviving frontier household records often emphasize how fire restored not just temperature but rhythm. Morning tasks interrupted by freezing nights resumed in a predictable order once heat stabilized the environment. The children sit closer to the warmth. Their expressions shift gradually, from exhaustion toward alertness. One rubs their hands together, not from cold now, but from habit. The difference between surviving and living often begins at moments like this, subtle and almost unnoticeable. You stand again feeling steadier than before. The floor beneath your feet still carries traces of cold near the edges of the room, but the center around the hearth has become a different world entirely. Warm air rises gently, replacing the suffocating stillness of night. The father steps outside once more. This time the door opens without hesitation. Cold air enters, briefly sharp but no longer overwhelming. It brushes across your face, then quickly loses strength as it meets the fire-warmed interior. He returns with measured steps. Snow clings to the bottom of his boots. It melts slowly near the threshold, forming small dark patches on the wood before evaporating under the heat. His expression suggests assessment rather than concern. The weather outside remains stable. No worsening storm, no immediate danger. That quiet confirmation shapes the direction of the day. In frontier conditions, certainty about weather often mattered more than comfort itself. It determined movement, labor, and survival planning. You notice how the cabin has fully transitioned. Night version of the space feels distant now, almost like a separate memory. Darkness, frost, and silence no longer define the environment. Instead, movement returns to every corner. The mother hands out small portions of food, warmed slightly near the fire. It is simple, but it feels different now. Food consumed after cold exposure carries a stronger sense of restoration. Even modest meals feel substantial when the body begins recovering from deep temperature loss. You take a seat again near the hearth. The fire continues to stabilize, burning more evenly now. Flames no longer struggle for balance. They rise and fall in steady patterns, casting moving light across the walls. Surviving homestead accounts from northern settlements frequently describe this moment as the true beginning of the day. Not sunrise outside, but the stabilization of fire inside the home. Outside, the forest continues to brighten. Snow reflects more light now, shifting from muted grey to clearer white tones. The landscape beyond the cabin appears calmer, though still heavily shaped by winter conditions. You watch the father preparing tools near the door. He organizes what will be needed for wood gathering. Axe out to coat rope, each item placed with purpose. Frontier life rarely allowed hesitation once fire returned. Resources had to be secured quickly while daylight and stability lasted. The mother cleans a small portion of the cabin floor. Melting snow near the threshold requires attention before it refreezes later. Small maintenance tasks like this were constant in winter households. Nothing could be left unattended for long. The children begin to speak more freely now. Their voices are still quiet, but no longer restrained by exhaustion. Morning warmth brings back expression and curiosity. Even simple conversation becomes a sign of recovery. You glance once more at the hearth. Fire continues steady, reliable, present, a quiet center around which everything else now reorganizes. Evidence from early frontier living conditions suggests that fire was often treated less as an object and more as a household anchor. Its presence determined how people moved, worked, and rested. You stretch your hands fully now. Stiffness has mostly faded. Cold remains at the edges of memory rather than sensation. The father opens the door again briefly. Light floods the threshold more strongly this time. The outside world appears clearer, sharper, and more defined under the strengthening morning sky. Snow stretches endlessly beyond the cabin, but it no longer feels like confinement. It feels like terrain. Terrain. Manageable. Navigable. The door closes again. Warmth returns immediately. Inside life continues its slow reassembly. Food is eaten. Tools are prepared. Fire is maintained. And the cabin, once frozen in the long silence of night, fully returns to its role as shelter workspace and living space for another winter day. Morning settles more fully now, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual softening of everything inside and outside the cabin. You notice it in the way the light behaves. It no longer slips through cracks in thin, hesitant lines. It presses more confidently against the wooden walls, turning frost into pale reflections instead of deep shadows. The entire room feels slightly wider, as if the space itself has expanded with the rising day. The fire continues to burn steadily in the hearth. Its presence is no longer fragile. It has become the center of movement again. Every sound in the cabin now orients itself around it. The crackle of wood, the shifting of pots, the quiet footsteps of people adjusting to morning tasks. You remain seated nearby for a moment longer. Warmth has reached most of your body now, but not evenly. One side still carries a faint memory of cold from the night. That uneven return of sensation feels strangely normal, almost expected after what you experienced. The mother moves with a quiet efficiency. She organizes what remains of food supplies, checking small containers and cloth wrappings with practiced attention. Frontier households often relied on careful morning inventory during winter months, ensuring nothing spoiled, froze improperly, or ran out unexpectedly. Surviving settler records describe mornings like this as a form of silent accounting. Every item mattered. Every portion had weight. Nothing existed in excess. The children are more awake now. Their movements are less cautious. One stretches slowly, testing their limbs after a long night of stillness. Another leans closer to the fire, not for survival now, but for comfort. You stand and step closer to the door again. This time curiosity replaces hesitation. The father is already outside. The door stands open briefly, allowing a strong wave of cold air to enter. It feels different now compared to the night. Sharper, yes, but no longer oppressive. It belongs to the morning rather than the unknown. You step closer to the threshold. Outside, the world is fully visible now. Snow blankets everything in continuous white layers. Trees stand motionless under their frozen weight. The sky is pale, not bright blue yet, but gradually clearing as the day continues to form. The father is inspecting the immediate surroundings. His boots sink slightly into the snow as he moves. He pauses, occasionally scanning distance and depth. Frontier life required constant awareness of terrain, especially after storms or deep freezes. Contemporary accounts from homestead regions often mention how mornings began with outdoor evaluation before any indoor routine was considered complete. Weather dictated labour more than time did. You watch him brush snow from a small cleared area near the cabin. Not much accumulation has built overnight, but enough to require attention. Even small drifts could affect movement paths, firewood access, or structural stability around the building. Inside, the fire continues steady. The mother begins warming water again. Steam rises more consistently now, filling the air with a faint sense of activity. The smell of smoke wood and heated moisture blends together into a familiar morning atmosphere. You return inside slowly. The warmth greets you immediately. Not overwhelming, just steady. The difference between inside and outside feels more defined now than at any point since waking. The cabin is no longer a fragile shelter against cold, it is a controlled space again. The children begin speaking more openly. Their voices are still soft but no longer hesitant. Morning restores language in small steps. First silence breaks, then movement returns, finally conversation follows. You sit near the hearth again, watching, listening. The fire burns with consistent strength now. Logs settle inward slowly as they are consumed, producing steady heat that spreads evenly through the cabin. Evidence from early frontier settlement writings suggests that families often measured the success of a winter morning by how quickly normal activity resumed after fire restoration. Cooking, cleaning, planning, and repair all depended on that central flame. The father re-enters the cabin. He brings in small additional wood pieces, enough for the next several hours, but not more than necessary. Supply management remained a constant concern in isolated environments where weather could limit access to resources unexpectedly. He places the wood near the hearth, then pauses, looking briefly at and the room. There is no conversation, but an understanding passes through the space. The night has been endured. The cabin is held. The day can proceed. You notice how your body feels now compared to earlier. Heavier in a different way, not from cold, from rest, from recovery. The exhaustion of the night has not fully disappeared, but it no longer dominates sensation. It sits beneath the surface, waiting to fade further as movement continues. The mother offers a simple portion of warmed food again. You take it without hesitation. It tastes different in morning light, less like survival, more like restoration. Outside brightness increases further. Snow now reflects a clearer tone and distant trees begin to show more detail. Branches, shapes and uneven textures emerge from what was previously uniform whiteness. The wilderness is no longer a single frozen impression. It is becoming a landscape again. The fire continues steady behind you. The cabin is warm. The day has begun. And the long night that once filled every corner of the world has fully retreated into memory, leaving only its quiet imprint behind. The cabin no longer feels like a place holding back the night. It feels like a place already inside the day. You notice the change most clearly in the sounds around you. The fire continues its steady rhythm, but it is no longer the only source of movement. Wood creaks with a different quality, now less strained and more natural. Outside, faint life returns to the forest in scattered, uneven moments. A distant bird call breaks the silence, soft, uncertain. Then another follows somewhere farther away. These small sounds signal what the eye cannot yet fully see. The wilderness is reactivating itself in layers. Frontier travelers often wrote that winter mornings revealed nature slowly, as if the world needed time to remember how to function after deep cold. You stand near the hearth, finishing the last of your warmed food. The sensation of heat inside your body is now stable, not intense, not fragile, just present. That steady warmth changes everything about perception. Even simple movement feels more intentional, less reactive. The mother begins reorganizing bedding. Blankets are shaken gently near the fire to release trapped cold air. Dampness from the night is slowly replaced by dry warmth. This process repeats in countless frontier households during winter mornings, where textiles were constantly rotated between cold and heat. The father checks tools again near the door. Axe, rope, outer coat, each item prepared with careful repetition. There is no rush, only sequence. The day is structured around survival tasks, and those tasks are determined by weather, wood supply, and distance to necessary resources. You glance outside again. The snow now appears brighter, almost reflective in places where sunlight reaches it directly. Shadows from trees are longer and more defined. The landscape has regained depth, replacing the flattened darkness of night. Surviving settler accounts from colder regions often describe this transition as the most visually dramatic part of winter life. The same environment shifts from threatening obscurity to structured clarity within a few hours. The children move around the cabin more freely now. One kneels near the fire watching what flames with a quiet curiosity. Another helps gather small items from sleeping areas, slowly returning order to the shared space. Their energy returns gradually, not all at once. You feel it too. A subtle restoration inside the body. Not full strength, but enough to think beyond immediate comfort. The mother pauses near the hearth and warms her hands briefly. This small gesture repeats across countless historical descriptions of winter life. Hands always needed recovery time after exposure to cold, even inside heated spaces. Skin remained sensitive for hours after freezing temperatures. Outside, a faint wind passes through the trees. Gentle, not threatening. It moves snow lightly across open areas, forming thin, drifting patterns along the ground. The forest responds in small motion, not chaos. The storm from the night is fully gone now, leaving only residual movement in its wake. You step closer to the doorway again. This time without hesitation, the father is already outside, walking a short perimeter around the cabin. His movements suggest inspection rather than urgency. He pauses near deeper snow patches, likely judging whether paths need clearing. Frontier survival depended heavily on this kind of early assessment. Daily decisions were shaped by terrain conditions, especially in winter, where snow depth determined mobility. You remain just inside the threshold. Warm air behind you, cold air ahead. The boundary between them feels sharp but manageable now. The cabin behind you continues its steady life. Fire crackles, fabric shifts, quiet conversation flows in short fragments. Everything inside is functional again. Outside, the world feels larger. Not threatening, just expansive. Snow stretches across uneven ground, forming soft contours over buried plants and fallen branches. The forest beyond stands patient, unchanged in structure but different in tone under daylight. The father returns briefly to the doorway. He speaks a few words about wood gathering and timing. Not urgent, just planned. The day's structure begins to form clearly. Tasks will be completed in order. Firewood first, then maintenance, then whatever additional needs arise before evening returns. Historical records from frontier homesteads often emphasize how winter days were divided into predictable cycles: morning recovery, midday labor, evening preparation, night endurance. You step fully outside now. The cold greets you, but it no longer feels overwhelming. It is simply part of the environment rather than a force acting against you. Snow compresses beneath your boots. A soft crunch replaces the silence of the cabin interior. The brightness of the snow makes you squint slightly. The sky above is pale and open, slowly clearing further as the morning continues. Breath still appears faintly in front of you, but it dissipates quickly. The air feels cleaner than it did during the night. Less dense, less enclosed. The father moves toward the tree line. You follow at a short distance. The forest stands quiet but visible now, every branch outlined in soft winter light. Paths must be created again through snow that accumulated during the night. A small detail noted in early settler journals describes how morning forest walks during winter often felt like entering a different world entirely compared to nighttime. Same terrain, different perception. You notice how your body responds differently now. Walking feels easier. Breathing feels more open. Cold no longer restricts movement in the same way. Ahead, the father lifts his axe slightly, preparing to begin work on nearby fallen wood. The day has fully transitioned. The night is no longer present in feeling or structure. Only memory remains, and in its place the steady rhythm of winter survival continues under a pale, widening morning sky. The forest feels different up close in daylight. Not safer, just more understandable. You walk behind the father as he moves through the snow, each step pressing into a surface that is firm but uneven beneath its soft upper layer. The sound of boots is steady now, replacing the quiet uncertainty of the night with something more grounded. Surviving frontier journals often describe this shift clearly. Night turned the wilderness into something imagined. Morning returned it to something physical, something that could be measured, crossed and used. Ahead of you, the father pauses near a fallen tree. It lies partially buried under snow, its trunk heavy with ice and frost. Branches extend outward like frozen limbs, each one coated in a thin layer of white. This is what remains of yesterday's wind, or perhaps earlier storms you did not notice during sleep. He studies it carefully. Not every fallen tree is useful. Some are too wet, too hollow, or too deeply frozen to burn efficiently. Early homestead records frequently mention how winter firewood collection required constant judgment, not just effort. He taps the wood once with his axe. The sound is dull, not promising. He moves on. You follow quietly, stepping through compressed snow left behind by earlier passes. The cold is still present, but it behaves differently now. It no longer surrounds you in layers of pressure. Instead, it exists in touch points, brief and direct. Your breath remains visible but thinner in the open air. The sky above is pale and steady, carrying no sign of returning storm. Light spreads evenly across the forest, revealing depth between the trees that was invisible during night. Contemporary settler accounts often mention how winter forests appeared almost unfamiliar after sunrise, even when nothing had changed physically. Hurst alone reshaped perception of distance and safety. The father stops again, this time at a second fallen branch cluster. He kneels, brushing snow away with his gloved hand. The wood beneath is darker than expected, likely holding moisture from previous snowfall. He tests it briefly, then shakes his head. Not suitable. You notice how selective this process is. Firewood gathering is not random collection. It is evaluation repeated many times until enough usable material is found. A small detail from frontier documentation noted that experienced settlers could judge wood quality by sound alone when struck or bent. Dry wood responded sharply. Wet wood absorbed impact without resonance. You hear the difference faintly as he tests another branch, a cleaner sound. He marks it mentally, then continues forward. The forest around you remains quiet except for movement of snow beneath your steps and occasional distant bird calls. These sounds feel more present now than they did earlier. Life is returning in fragments. You glance back toward the cabin. It sits partially visible through the trees. Small, solid. Smoke now rises gently from its chimney, thin but steady. That single detail transforms its appearance entirely. What was once a fragile shelter during a night becomes an active point of warmth in the landscape. Frontier survival narratives often emphasize this visual transformation. A smoking chimney in winter was not just comfort, and it was confirmation of life continuing. The father calls out briefly for you to help gather smaller branches. His voice carries clearly through the cold air. You begin collecting pieces scattered near the ground. Some are half buried in snow. Others lie exposed where wind cleared them during the night. Each piece is inspected briefly before being added to the growing bundle. Your hands begin to feel the cold again, but differently than before. Not the deep numbness of night, but surface exposure that changes with movement. A wind passes lightly through the trees. It shifts snow from higher branches, causing small cascades to fall silently to the ground. The motion is delicate, almost invisible unless watched closely. Accounts from early homesteads frequently mention that winter forests never truly became still. Even on calm days, subtle movement continued in layers above ground level. You pause for a moment, holding a small branch. It is dry enough. Likely usable. You place it with the others. The father inspects the growing bundle, then nods slightly. It is not a large amount, but sufficient for this next portion of the day. He begins leading this way back toward the cabin. The walk feels easier now than earlier. The forest is fully visible and direction is clear. No uncertainty remains about terrain or weather. This clarity reduces mental strain more than physical effort. You follow him back along the path. Snow compresses underfoot with consistent rhythm. The cabin grows larger again as you approach. Smoke from the chimney rises steadily into the pale morning sky. The structure feels more stable now, as if it has fully reasserted itself after the night's exposure. Inside, the warmth will continue building. Fire will remain active. Food will be prepared, and the day will move forward in predictable stages. Surviving settler accounts often describe this part of winter mornings as the most productive period when energy returned and tasks were completed before evening cold set in again. You step closer to the door. Cold air remains outside, but it no longer feels like a boundary between survival and danger. It is simply part of the environment to move through and manage. The cabin awaits with its steady fire, and the winter day continues its slow, practical unfolding. The cabin feels warmer each time you return to it, not because the fire has grown dramatically, but because your body has learned to recognize the difference between outside and inside more clearly. That distinction becomes sharper after surviving a night without heat. You step through the doorway, brushing snow from your boots. The wooden floor creaks beneath you with familiar resistance. Inside, the fire continues its steady rhythm, no longer fragile or uncertain. It burns with a stable confidence now supported by the wood gathered earlier. Contemporary frontier records often describe this return from wood gathering as a small but important transition in the day. The outside world is cold and expansive. The interior becomes structured and controlled again. The father places the gathered branches near the hearth. He does not rush. Nothing in this environment rewards haste. Every action is measured, shaped by necessity rather than urgency. The mother resumes tending to small tasks near the fire. Water is checked again. Food is adjusted. Blankets are folded and stacked in a corner to dry more evenly in the heat. Even simple household organization becomes part of survival strategy during long winters. You sit briefly near the hearth once more. Warmth now reaches you almost immediately. The difference between this moment and the night before feels almost unreal in contrast. Then the cabin was a container of cold. Now it is a controlled space where cold exists only at the edges. Surviving homestead accounts frequently emphasize this contrast as one of the defining emotional cycles of winter life. Endurance at night, recovery in the morning, preparation for repetition, Outside, the forest remains visible through the small gaps near the door. Light has grown stronger. Snow reflects a clearer brightness now, and shadows between trees appear more defined. The wilderness is no longer indistinct. It has structure again. The father begins preparing for another short trip, not into deep forest this time, only toward nearby areas where additional wood might be gathered before conditions change again. Winter weather, even when stable, remained unpredictable in small ways. He checks the axe again, then his coat, then pauses briefly before stepping outside. You notice how routine this has become. Every departure is careful, every return is measured. Frontier life rarely allowed spontaneity during winter months. The door opens. Cold air enters briefly, then closes again. Inside, the fire continues to strengthen as more wood is added. Flames respond quickly, rising higher with each new piece. Heat spreads across the cabin more evenly now, reaching corners that were cold during the night. The children are more active now. One helps arrange items near the wall. Another watches the fire, closely fascinated by its movement. Morning curiosity replaces nighttime exhaustion in small gradual steps. You stand and move closer to the doorway again. The outside world appears calm. Snow is bright under daylight and the forest stands still but no longer oppressive. It feels like a place to work in rather than a place to endure. Surviving settler narratives often describe this psychological shift as one of the most important survival mechanisms during long winters. The ability to reframe environment from threat to task ensured daily function could continue. The father returns shortly after. He carries a small additional bundle of wood. Not large, but enough to extend stability further into the day. He places it near the hearth and nods once before sitting down briefly. No conversation follows. There rarely needs to be. The mother begins warming simple food again. Steam rises more consistently now, blending with the smell of wood smoke. The cabin feels fully active. You notice how your senses have adjusted. Cold no longer dominates awareness. It exists but at a distance. Even your breathing feels easier, less restricted by freezing air. Outside, faint movement appears among distant branches. Small birds shifting from one tree to another. Their presence is subtle but meaningful. Life continues even in winter, though in reduced and careful forms. Frontier accounts from colder regions often mention how animal activity was closely observed each morning. It provided reassurance that the ecosystem remained stable despite harsh conditions. You return to your seat near the hearth. The fire now burns with steady consistency, no longer requiring attention every moment. It maintains itself with minimal adjustment, freeing the household to focus on other tasks. The father begins inspecting minor repairs inside the cabin. A loose board near the window. A small gap near the door frame. Simple maintenance that prevents larger problems later. Winter survival depended heavily on preventing small issues from becoming structural failures. The mother distributes warmed food. Everyone eats slowly. The atmosphere inside the cabin feels stable now. Not comfortable in a modern sense, but functional and steady. You look briefly toward the fire again. It remains central, unchanging in importance. A constant point around which everything else organizes itself. Surviving homestead writings often describe fire not as a feature of the home, but as its core system. Everything depended on it. Heat, cooking, safety, even emotional stability. The cabin continues its slow rhythm of morning life. An outside winter remains present, but no longer overwhelming. The day is fully under now, shaped by routine rather than survival urgency. By late morning, the cabin has settled into a steady rhythm that feels almost ordinary again. Almost. The memory of the night still lingers in the edges of your awareness, like cold that refuses to fully disappear, even after warmth returns. You notice it most when you move away from the hearth for too long, or when your hand touches a colder surface near the walls. Inside the cabin, life continues in small, practical motions. The mother cleans and rearranges folding bedding more tightly now that it has dried in the fire's heat. The children move with more energy, though still not fully recovered from the long night. Their voices are softer than they would be in warmer seasons, but they are present again. The father works near the doorway, reinforcing small weak points in the structure. A loose gap between logs is packed with cloth. A nail is checked and tightened. A draft near the floor is reduced with a careful wedge of wood. Contemporary homestead records often describe this constant maintenance as a defining feature of winter living. A cabin was never finished. It was always being adjusted to survive another night. You sit near the fire watching the light shift across the room. By now the flames have reached full stability. They no longer flicker with uncertainty. They move in a slow, steady pattern, casting warmth evenly across the cabin's interior. The difference between this and the night before feels almost unreal. Then the same space held silence, frost, and tension. Now it holds movement, conversation, and function. Outside, the forest remains visible through the doorway whenever it opens. Snow still lies thick across the ground, but the sunlight has strengthened, giving the landscape a clearer definition. Shadows between trees stretch longer and more structured. You step outside briefly again. The cold meets you immediately, but it's no longer overwhelming. It feels like a boundary rather than a force, a condition you pass through instead of something that stops you. The father is already a short distance away, inspecting a second area for wood. He pauses, occasionally judging fallen branches and assessing whether they are worth collecting. Surviving frontier accounts often mention how this decision-making process became instinctive over time. Experience replaced hesitation. Not all wood was equal, and choosing poorly could mean another difficult night. You walk a little farther from the cabin, following a narrow path in the snow. Each step compresses the surface beneath your boots. The sound is consistent grounding. Around you the forest is quiet in a different way than last night. It is no longer absence of sound, but presence of subtle activity. Wind moves lightly through branches. Snow shifts occasionally from higher limbs. The wilderness is no longer hidden. It is simply calm. You notice how your perception of distance has changed since morning. The trees feel closer, more defined. The world no longer dissolves into darkness at the edges. The father calls out briefly. Not urgent, just a signal to return. He has gathered enough wood for the immediate need. You both begin walking back toward the cabin. The path feels easier now, partially reinforced by earlier movement. Snow remains thick but manageable. The landscape no longer resists travel in the same way it did during the storm. As you approach the cabin, smoke rises steadily from the chimney, a constant thin line against the pale sky. That single detail changes everything about how the structure feels. It is no longer just shelter. It is active, living in its own quiet way. Inside, the mother is preparing another small task. Warming water again, checking stored supplies, adjusting items near the hearth so heat is distributed more evenly. Everything revolves around maintaining stability now that fire has returned. You step back inside. Warm air greets you immediately. The contrast with the outside remains sharp but not painful. It feels more like transition than shock. The children are gathered near the fire again, listening to soft conversation from the mother. Their attention shifts between warmth and curiosity, slowly rebuilding energy lost during the night. Surviving settlement diaries frequently note that this period of late morning often marked the emotional recovery phase after harsh nights. Bodies stabilized, minds relaxed, normal routines re-emerged. You sit once more near the hearth. The fire remains unchanged in strength, steady, reliable. The cabin feels fully functional again, no longer fragile, no longer suspended between survival and uncertainty. The father begins planning for the next sequence of tasks, likely involving additional wood gathering, or small repairs before afternoon conditions shift. Winter days required continuous preparation, even when mornings felt calm. You watch quietly as the household resumes its structured rhythm. Every movement now feels purposeful. Every sound fits into a familiar pattern. Outside, the snow can be used reflecting bright daylight. The forest stands unchanged, but now clearly part of a navigable environment rather than a threatening unknown. You realize how quickly perception has shifted. Only hours earlier, the cabin held silence, cold and fragile endurance. Now it holds warmth, motion, and direction. The difference is not in the structure. It is in the return of fire, and with it, the return of ordinary life inside a place that survived another winter night. The afternoon arrives without ceremony. It simply replaces the morning, as though time itself has decided to continue moving forward without announcing the change. Inside the cabin, everything feels more stable now. The fire burns with quiet consistency, no longer demanding constant attention. Its presence has shifted from urgent necessity to steady background warmth. Light moves gently across the wooden walls, revealing the texture of the logs more clearly than at any point during the night. You notice small details now that were invisible before. Cracks in the timber, marks from previous repairs, darkened patches where smoke has slowly accumulated over many winters. Contemporary homestead accounts often describe this phase of the day as when the cabin becomes most familiar again. Morning chaos fades and structure returns, tasks are completed, movement slows into rhythm. The mother continues working near the hearth, preparing simple midday food. The children are calmer now, less reactive, more settled into quiet activity. One sits near the wall watching dust particles drift through the light. Another traces patterns in the wooden floor absent-mindedly. The father sits briefly near the table examining tools. Maintenance remains a constant responsibility in frontier life. Even when immediate danger has passed, preparation for the next challenge never stops. Axes are sharpened, handles checked, rope inspected for weakness. You sit near the fire again. Warmth has fully integrated into your body now. There is no longer contrast between cold memory and present heat, only gradual continuity. Outside, the snow remains bright under afternoon light. The forest stands still but not empty. Subtle motion continues in branches, in drifting powder, in distant animal movement too small to notice clearly. You step outside once more. The air meets you calmly. Cold is present but balanced, not aggressive, just part of the environment you move through. The father is nearby collecting remaining usable branches from earlier locations. His movements are slower now, less driven by urgency and more by routine completion. Surviving frontier documentation frequently emphasizes how winter afternoons were used for consolidation rather than expansion. Morning focused on recovery and resource gathering. Afternoon focused on preparation and stabilization. You walk a short distance through the snow. The ground is more compact now, where repeated steps have created a temporary path. Snow still resists, but less strongly than before. The forest feels quieter again at this hour, not because sound is absent, but because activity has shifted deeper into the landscape and life continues but less visibly. You pause for a moment looking back at the cabin. Smoke continues rising steadily from the chimney. That single element defines everything about the structure. It is no longer a cold shelter enduring winter. It is a functioning centre of warmth within a frozen environment. You return inside after a short time. The transition feels natural now. No shock from the temperature difference, just movement between conditions. Inside the cabin remains active. The mother checks stored supplies again, organising what will be needed for the following day. Food, fuel and materials are always measured carefully in winter conditions. Nothing is wasted, nothing is assumed. The children move closer to the fire again, drawn naturally to its steady heat. You sit with them near the hearth. The fire crackles softly. Wood settles. Flames shift in slow patterns. The cabin feels complete in its current state. Not luxurious, not comfortable in a modern sense, but stable, functional, secure enough to face another night when it arrives. Surviving settler narratives often describe this moment of the day as the quietest form of relief. Not joy, not celebration, just recognition that survival has continued successfully into another cycle. The father returns with a final small bundle of wood. He places it near the hearth and nods once. No further explanation is needed. The household understands the pattern now. Gather, repair, maintain, repeat. Outside a light begins to shift slightly, toward later afternoon tones. Shadows lengthened across the snow. The forest takes on a softer contrast as the sun continues its slow descent. You realize how structured the day has become again. Morning was recovery. Afternoon is maintenance. Evening will be preparation. Night will be endurance. The cycle repeats, but it's no longer uncertain. It is understood. You watch the fire for a long moment. It burns steadily, reliable, present. The cabin holds its warmth without struggle now. An outside winter continues quietly. No longer an unknown threat, but a familiar condition the household is prepared to face again when darkness returns. Evening does not arrive quickly in winter. It drifts in slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the day is reluctant to end after so much effort to stabilize itself. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifts again, but gently this time. There is no sudden drop in temperature, no sharp or change in silence. Instead, light begins to soften, and shadows lengthen across the wooden walls in gradual layers. You notice the fire first. It remains steady, but its role changes slightly. During the afternoon it supported activity. Now it begins to define comfort, again gathering people closer as the outside world dims. Surviving frontier journals often describe evening as the most reflective part of winter life. Work slowed, conversations softened, movement became more deliberate. The cabin transitioned from labor space to shelter once more. The mother prepares the final simple meal of the day, nothing elaborate, just enough to sustain the night ahead. The children sit closer together near the hearth, their energy lower now, shaped by a full day of recovery after the long cold night. Their voices are quieter again, but not from fatigue this time, more from calm. The father checks the fire one last time. He adjusts the logs carefully, ensuring it will last through the early hours of darkness. Fire management at night was always critical in frontier conditions. Too little fuel risks cold exposure, but too much risked waste. Balance was everything. You sit near the hearth and watch the flames settle into their evening rhythm. The light they produce now feels softer than in the morning. Less about survival, more about presence. It fills the cabin, evenly reducing shadows rather than sharpening them. Outside, the forest begins to fade again. Snow still reflects faint light, but the contrast between land and sky becomes less distinct. Trees slowly disappear into a shared greyness that marks the return of night. You step toward the doorway one final time. Cold air waits beyond it. Not violent, just patient. The transition between inside and outside feels familiar now. You no longer hesitate in the same way. The cabin has proven itself again through another full cycle of winter life. You step back inside. Warmth immediately surrounds you again. The contrast remains, but it no longer feels dramatic. It feels expected. Surviving homestead accounts often note that by evening the cabin itself seemed to settle into its most stable form. All necessary tasks completed, all resources accounted for, all people gathered inside. The mother begins arranging sleeping areas once more, not for immediate rest, but for preparation. Bedding is positioned near the warmest parts of the cabin. Blankets are checked for dryness. Small adjustments are made to ensure comfort during the coming night. The children watch the fire quietly. Their expressions are calm now, no longer shaped by the memory of the night before, but by the safety of the present moment. You remain seated near the hearth. The fire crackles steadily. Each sound feels measured and familiar now, as if the cabin has developed its own voice throughout the day. Outside, darkness begins to gather more noticeably. Not sudden, just steady. The sky loses its brightness, gradually replaced by the deeper tones of blue and grey. Snow outside becomes less reflective as light diminishes. The father sits down briefly, not to rest fully, just to observe. His attention remains on the fire, the room, and the subtle changes that signal the return of night. Experience in frontier environments often made people sensitive to these transitions. You feel it too now. Not fear, just awareness. The cycle is returning. The mother finally sits near the fire as well. The household gathers again in shared space, repeating the same pattern that sustained them through countless winters. Surviving settlement narratives often emphasize this repetition as both exhausting and stabilizing. Each day mirrored the last, yet each successful cycle reinforced survival. You look around the cabin. Everything is familiar now. The walls, the hearth, the blankets, the people. Even the cold at the edges feels predictable rather than threatening. The fire continues to burn steadily. Its glow reflects across the room, softening the return of darkness outside. And as evening fully settles over the winter wilderness, the cabin remains warm, occupied, and alive, holding steady. It's again against the long night that is slowly approaching, not as an unknown anymore, but as something already endured. Sleep well.